if you want. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Michele. Yes, I will try right away to share my screen. So, these are my slides. Can you see them? Yes. Great. So, comments are mainly related to administrative and fiscal data. So this is the viewpoint I took in making my comments. And I will begin with some general comment concerning the general discussion we had in panel 1, because for the first time in TDIM, fiscal data is included, which we provided from the finance department by extracting data from tax returns, but also we were lucky enough to already have this data matched with Eurosilk, because this match is used for our own microsimulation models in the finance department that my colleague Marco Manzo is responsible for. When we speak about administrative data, the detail lies in the devil, the devil lies in the details, because this data are built for administrative purposes. And so this is something that became evident with IMSS data, where the minimum level of contribution and its application generated that problem of producing polarization on a certain level, that of minimum level of contribution. So something very innovative was performed with this imputation that was described in panel 1 in order to overcome this problem. Naturally, we work a lot with tax returns, and even though we are great fans of these data, also tax returns do have some problems in terms of interpretation. For instance, in fiscal data, unemployment benefits and redundancy fund is treated for fiscal purposes as if it were an income from work. This is a problem of our fiscal data that, however, is not present in those from IMSS. And in this case, the fact that you also use IMSS data is a very good aspect, because it's very solid as an approach. And I was noting in this chart that in the comparison between the Ministry of Finance data and those used by TDIM concerning tax returns, in some income intervals, the MEF data have got a higher frequency, which is due to the fact that fiscal data consider redundancy fund as an income from employment. So it's better to have different administrative sources at one's disposal, so that they can add more information, because one can compensate for the defects of another. As far as my other comments are concerned, they relate to the wealth module. I would like to add some comments concerning the labor market module, even though they're not in my slides, just because they came up to my mind as I was following your presentations. It's two things, basically. One is related to the issue of those who were born abroad. So the phenomenon of immigration is very important, relevant. And I was wondering if, since you make a difference between those who are EU born or non-EU born, from what I looked at, I was wondering if it's possible perhaps to make a different type of classification, because, for instance, between the EU born, there are those who were born in Germany or in Bulgaria, who have very different employment trends, or non-EU citizens, immigrants that maybe come from, I don't know, Pakistan or the United States. So I was wondering if it's possible to try and group differently these, for instance, the people who are born in non-EU high-income countries and low-income countries within the euro without, in order to better use the data concerning these individuals. Another doubt I have is that in the estimate of the working and income dynamics of individuals, you considered also a certain intergenerational persistence of revenue. In the documentation in PDF, not in the slides, I noticed that you speak about a certain persistence, and I was wondering if you have considered the fact that coming from wealthy families, one has a chance of continuing to have a high income, and whereas you tend to have a lower income if you come from a lower income household, even though of course there is still a chance of moving or changing one's income brackets. So these are the two suggestions or observations I would like to make concerning the employment, the labor market part. As far as the wealth sector is concerned, the wealth module, I've seen that in terms of liabilities, you only consider mortgage. So since wealth is also related to consumption, I was wondering if we could include consumption credit in this model, credit to consumption, and I quoted here a report on credit to consumption, which tells us that credit to consumption has increased considerably, and also consumption and saving patterns have changed. And I was wondering, therefore, if this can be considered as an aspect to be included in the model. Another aspect I would like to point at, and I've noticed that you have already considered it in terms of future developments of the TDIM, has to do with the fact that there are no differences in terms of the returns on financial and real investments. And I was wondering if risk could be included, because what may happen is that if you got your savings in equity, you may also risk great losses, with the risk of losing a large portion of the wealth that could be used for protection purposes. So all the MiFID regulations on investment adequacy to a certain extent protect lower income families from investing in types of risky investments. So there are already some protection rules. We know that they do not always work properly. And last but not least, these slides are related to an aspect that you have already highlighted, so the underreporting of financial activities. So first of all, I want to commend you for the part concerning real estate data. The merger with cadastral data makes this part very solid, and I imagine that you do not use cadastral value, but the market value. So that part of financial or real estate data, I think, is very solid in your model. But the part concerning financial activities, as you have acknowledged yourself, is marked by this under-reporting distortion. And I suggest and I am again quoting myself, and I apologize for this, but I'm referring to this report in which we focus on the concentration of wealth by looking at data other than those of the SHIW. So we use the entire set of data from inheritance declarations. And that is because in inheritance tax files, there is no problem in terms of voluntary underreporting. There's just tax evasion that can be there, but only of the offshore type, because it's difficult to evade taxes in the case of inheritance rather than in the case of income. So in the case of death, it's very difficult to hide the wealth. So in this study, we used fiscal declaration data, including mortality data, mortality multipliers method. So I wish to highlight that in comparison with SHIY data, we see higher concentration of personal wealth. And what we observe is the actual trend. We've got data coming from inheritance tax files, and these data were imputed to some assets that are missing in inheritance declarations. So when we compare them with the trends in SHIW, and we look at the top 1% individuals, we see a trend that is rising when we base ourselves on inheritance tax files. And the same goes but the other way around with the first 5 deciles of wealth, the wealth of individual according to wealth precisely. We see a decrease in the amount of wealth possessed in individuals compared with the SHIW. Levels, of course, differ depending on whether you take the individual or over a household. But the SHIW trend is much more stable, whereas in our case, the decrease is much higher. And this has also have an impact on the Gini index in our data from 2005 to 2019, and we see an increase from 0.62 to 0.76. So these trends are explained by wealth of the non-housing type, so financial wealth, which is this line with the triangles. So for your future improvements, this may be a source to introduce corrections, because this underreporting may have effects on the level of concentration of wealth, so an underestimation of rich people's wealth, and a possible overestimation of the wealth of the poor. The trend that you are looking at over the long period, well, it's possible that these trends continue over time, even though we've seen that there has been a change recently. And this can also have an impact on the vulnerability of low-income households. So, since you've got mortis causa transfers, this type of suggestions may be useful in order to better calibrate in mortis causa transfers, which we have looked at in the previous presentation. So there is a growing trend in the wealth that is going to be transferred mortis causa. So the fact of better measuring these aspects of wealth will lead to a further increase in the trends you have illustrated. So this is all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Very interesting. And I'm now giving the floor to Federico Berotti. Thank you, Michele. Good morning to everyone. I too have some slides, and I will try to be very fast because we are running late. So, can you see the slides? So, as Michele was saying, in fact, I do not work on the topics of the labor market or wealth. I work for the Department of Economics and Finance at the University of Rome Tor Vergata, and I'm responsible for the assessment of econometric methods for panel data, including spatial and network ones. And I have been dealing with dynamic microsimulation models, but in a very different context compared with yours. And in fact, our model is an international model, which is still dynamic, but which is focused on health and healthcare expenditure. I hope I can give you some suggestions, though, that can help you improve things, particularly in terms of the estimator of econometric models, will help you improve the excellent work you are already doing. In general, I was very much struck by this new comprehensive structure of the TDIM. So because it's a microsimulation model of the dynamic type, it really allows you not to forecast, but to project and assess the impact of alternative scenarios versus a basic scenario. And the fact that you can use ADI Silk is really impressive, because having the possibility of using a panel-based data source, even though of the sample type matched with administrative data of several types, including cadastral data or those of the tax return agency or the SHIW data, it's really relevant in my opinion. And from what I realized, the estimates you made are, as far as the probability for working or changing one's occupation or wage equation, etc., they seem to me to be sensible and in line with expectations. My comments are very fast indeed, and they concern two aspects. One more general, that was also reconsidered by the previous presentations in part, and has to do with the element of uncertainty in the model, and considering results also by looking at the aspect of validation internally and externally whenever possible. This is a chart that comes from our own model and projects over time up until 2050 the prevalence of hypertension in some OECD countries, 9 European nations in particular. So the importance of having a confidence band is in fact something that is that comes out of comparing different scenarios and being able to say if the differences that one is observing are significant or not, even though uncertainty mainly in this model comes from the randomness of the Monte Carlo simulation. But we can also consider other sources of uncertainty, such as the fact that you have some sample data, and through bootstrapping, you can include also other sources of uncertainty to make these confidence bands even more reliable. As far as internal and external validation is concerned, I haven't seen anything. An internal type of validation may be the following that was perhaps in part described previously. So you have the intention of projecting over time your data. You start from 2016, but you also have previous data. So if you estimate models on previous data, you can perhaps start a little bit earlier and look internally if your model is capable of exactly reproducing what the trend in your database is, which you use as your population stock. As external validation is concerned, this is a bit more complex as a situation, particularly concerning long-term projections, because it's not easy to find certain aspects, such as what you find in Eurostat or UN projections concerning the variables considered. This is an example that we made a few years ago, precisely on the projection of Italian pension benefits, old age pensions in Italy, for 2 age brackets. The red one is the TDIM of a few years ago, the TDIM projection 2.0 of a few years ago. I think it was 2017, whereas the blue one is the one that we made with our model, which is the global FEM. And I didn't say that before, but it is focused only on individuals aged 50 or above. So it only looks at that bracket of the population, and in particularly at the time we had developed a model on pensions that we wanted to assess, and we did with the TD. So I didn't find any trace of these aspects, and I think that if you get to 3.0, the 3.0 version, your team should consider them also in connection with future relationships, that these are considered. In connection with the econometric aspects concerning estimates for the models that are at the basis of the projections you have already obtained, I've seen that two significant suggestions can, and that you've already highlighted in your conclusions, come from, for instance, considering dynamic models, and in addition to dynamic models, also considering where necessary, and I've seen that there isn't a great internal variability in some models, so in some cases this is pointless, but where necessary, you should consider always a correlation between the covariates you are including in the model and the heterogeneity observed as invariant over time. In this sense, my suggestion would be to follow this approach, which is really simple to estimate, and that requires nothing more than a probit or a logit for a pooling or a random or a logit random effect, as you did in connection with the probability of working, because it only needs including the lagged variable over time and the initial conditions. So the first observation over time for all the individuals, and the mean values for the time varying variables to consider this correlation. So this model can be estimated easily with statistical software, but in your case, all you need is to estimate it with a pool head solution, because at the end of the day, I don't think you've got problems in terms of efficiency. And this is also a question for Chiara, Elena, and Michele. I think that in simulating or projecting your outcomes, you consider the entire set of estimates that you obtain from these models, whether they are statistically significant or not, I would imagine, precisely to maintain some feedback to the model. Chiara was saying that you only include the variables that in turn are simulated within the model, and which ensure an internal consistency, and also the possibility of having an internal feedback in sense what happens when age increases, what happens when education increases, what happens when labor market experience increases. So in this sense, I wouldn't really focus on looking at what is in the error, but trying to take everything out of this error. In other words, efficiency becomes secondary to specification. I've got another question concerning what I read in a slide, that something like in the projection, once we estimate a logit random effect, we post-estimate random effects for sample individuals, and then we extract from a normal estimate for the out-of-sample or newborn ones, so new cohorts in a sense that become part of the model. My question is, how do you do that in a nonlinear model? How do you do that? And then two quick considerations. The first is that everything I said can also be implemented for a multinomial outcome, but there too, the dynamic correlation is very important. There is this paper which refers to which articles that I mentioned proposes such a model. So a multinomial model for panel data of the dynamic type, random effect, but correlated random effect, which also gives you the chance of considering the cross-state dependence. So the state before being different from the subsequent one. And as I was saying, this is my last slide, you spoke about irregularity spaced over time, irregularly spaced observations over time. This is what often happens in panel data of the unbalanced type of this type. We usually include in a log delta age model to take this irregularity into account, and we've seen that this works also to make sure that dynamic models can function from this perspective. And then I don't understand why you use a regression, a wage regression, rather than a Poisson. There is a debate in the statistical field in this connection, but Poisson allows you basically to obtain predictions that are strictly positive, but not to deal with the problem of retransformation starting from a linear log. And then you have used an REGLS, I would imagine, of the linear type for estimating the model concerning the number of months worked by working individuals. So a count variable of the positive type. And I am wondering how you did that in terms of projections, if you projected the worked hours to ensure that this outcome is bigger than zero. If estimate was made by a random effect GLS, that does not necessarily ensure this. So I'm finished, and I thank you again, and I wish you all the best for the rest of this workshop. Thank you, Federico, very clear. And I would like now to give the floor quickly for 3 to 4 minutes to our guests if they want to provide an answer or make some considerations considering what was said so far. Let us begin with Elena, if she wants to say something. Well, there are so many aspects, so yes, well, you can only refer to the most relevant one, then you can chat among you. Well, the comments were really, really interesting. And I would like to tell Federico Bellotti that we are working also with others who had given some indications in this sense. So we will be in touch because the things that you said are part of the implementations we want to make ourselves. Thank you. So I would like to begin from the first set of discussions. Giovanni, in connection to state over time, the data silk, the ADISILK data set, we made some choices, and this has got repercussions on what was observed later. So Michele made some choices which are not those that we considered, because depending on your objectives, you can develop your data set accordingly. And in this sense, the prevailing state was chosen. So if an individual has got more than one relationship, a prevailing relationship is chosen, and it is imputed as the only one existing. And this, of course, could flatten that dynamic that we expect, and that without making such a choice we may not see. Concerning the idea of adding variables such as the territorial one, so what happens to students when they go find a job? Well, this is, in this connection, we limited ourselves to what the literature says, and so we do not include in the model what is not simulated, because it's as if we were using the variables that we simulate by taking into account what these variables bring with them. IMPS and SILK speak the same language. Yes, this is something we readily realized because we considered topics such as dropout information, and you will find all these things in the intermediate report. I don't know if Chiara wishes to add something on what I said so far, to what I said so far. No, but just that the fact of adding other variables such as region of residence and sector of economic activity, well, these are all variables that can be useful to estimate probability of working, salary, etc., but precisely because estimates are used for the microsimulation model, they do not have any autonomous motivation. We decided to maintain this consistency between the world we considered in the estimates and the measuring model. A comment on what was said concerning immigrants. If there are different groupings possible compared to what we presented, well, there is a further detail concerning country of birth, but we should consider that these are very small groups, so even making further differences in estimates is not really significant, because we would reduce the amount of the individual cells. Many other indications Many of the comments that were made are really interesting, and I want to thank all the discussants. Some of the suggestions, we have been thinking about them as well, like introducing some dynamics or introducing improvements in the econometric estimates, such as those that Mr. Bellotti quoted. I cannot remember all the various comments that were made, but in a general sense, one thing that I've taken down was the possibility of imputing individual effects, the estimated effects to out-of-sample individuals. But this was done only for linear models such as salaries and months worked, but not for non-linear models. I don't know if Simone wishes to add something, and the other, and Michele too. Well, as far as what Giovanni Gallo said, the values of financial wealth are imputed to all the Silk households, but starting from the SHIW data through the statistical matching methodology, while estimates on consumption are not imputed, but they are the real one of the SHIW. In connection with the financial literacy aspects concerning private pensions, they are included in the second and third pillar. Among significant variables, yes, I was just saying that there are also variables that are important. I wasn't suggesting you include them. Yes, those you mentioned are not those that we use. We also include education.
For instance, as I said before, all of the variables, that is to say special variables, cannot be included, and of course they're not included and not provided for. And as to the rest, with all of the remarks by Achari, especially when it comes to the consumer credit and also all of the data, and also range of the activities, and also what Professor Morelli said. So it seems to me that these are useful suggestions, and also a number of suggestions by Federico relating to the possibility to include dynamic items in the estimates. Well, this has to be taken into consideration. So thank you, and I give the floor to Simone. One final thing, I don't know whether as to the supplementary pension, it is important to consider, for instance, and I don't remember whether that was simulated and included in the model or not. Thank you. Yeah, but then this is not simulated. And it would improve a lot, all of the estimates, but it cannot be considered as a dynamic predictor. So I'd like to thank the discussant that provided us with a lot of inputs. It will be useful and will be useful to continue to work on these items. And I try to add a couple of things. For instance, it relates to what I've done with Michele, that is to say, for instance, wealth. Of course, we have a lot of problems and things that can be improved, but there are two main items to be considered and which were also mentioned by the discussants. One relates to the savings and consumption, which are limitedly dynamic, whereas we know that consumptions generally have a dynamic structure linked to the habits, and also this is something we've reasoned upon, and also it relates to the fact that at the moment all of the wealth processes are estimated as relating to the CIV. So a problem arises, that is to say, an imbalancing between the timeliness and also the simulation of 1 year. So in the past we did so, and of course we carried out a number of activities with Carlo Mazzaferro, and we estimated it within the dynamic approach on the shift data, and then the dynamic parameter was included in the simulation. So, of course, there are several differential problems and macro simulation, and we also add other problems in terms of sampling and also, for instance, the variation. So, for sure, there's a big problem bringing to the internal validity, and we are doing so already. So, there was a choice. That is to say, to start from today or tomorrow to simulate, and we are actually using 5 years as an internal simulation approach. Then the savings behaviors are too stiff, too rigid, in the sense that they are not reacting to the expected distribution of the wealth, and they are very much aligned to the past, to the recent past, whereas it would be useful to introduce on the one side, for instance, to link it to macro models as to the evolution of the savings approach of the time. And the fact of saying that the elderly save a lot of money in Italy, well, that is quite limitedly possible. Because, of course, if the scenario changes and we have a limited wealth and a different scenario, well, I'm not sure that the elderly continue to save so much money as they did in the past. And also with an intergenerational approach. And relating to this, there's the portion relating to the intergenerational transfers that Paolo was mentioning. And in this case, well, we've seen our activity. And of course, we will refer to, I will try to refer to this item to provide additional weights. But since this is based on econometric estimates, it is important to have the microdata, especially when it comes to the intergenerational flows, because of course, in the model we have, for instance, the shift data, and probably this is not a survey that focuses on this specific item, and then everything takes place later in the lives of people. And of course, this increases inequality among and between young people and the elderly. So, of course, additional information will be needed because, of course, additional information is needed on flows, for instance. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. We have some hopes now. I don't see questions, and due to time constraints, I think it is high time to close. So Irene, please tell us when we're meeting. I'm going to have a light lunch, very light. Yeah, of course, very light lunch because we're meeting back at 2 o'clock. So that we're going to keep with the schedule relating to the other speakers and discuss. And so apologies for the delay, and enjoy your lunch. So now we can resume our words and the floor to Ricardo. Please, you have the floor. Okay, now I'm sharing the presentation, just a couple of seconds to answer to a question that started in panel 1 relating to the representativeness of the sample. This was also mentioned in panel 2, and there was the initial question by Maria Luisa on the households and individuals. So we wanted to understand, and those of you that are discussants or speakers, we are, of course, checking everything, and of course it starts from the household, and we check the individual situation. And in fact, what Stefano showed is a important consistency relating to the original weight. Panel 3 now, pensions and social protection. So Stefano Bosco and I are here. Then as discussants we have Carlo Mazzaferra, who's been dealing with the Italian pension systems, and then we have with us Francesco Figari, Professor of Science of Finance at the University of Insubria, and it is with tax benefit. And Marco Di Marco, who deals with microsimulation models and also tax benefit, and also the Fatimon model that, among the other things, has been adopted quite recently for the estimation of the income supporting those in need, the so-called reddito di cittadinanza, the citizenship income. So I'll tackle the main structure of the pension module, and I'll show you some preliminary results, and then I'll give the floor to Stefano, who's going to talk about the tax benefit module and the preliminary results. So always the structure of the module. So after the labor market module and before the wealth module, all modules mentioned in the previous panel. Nothing strange here. On an annual basis, all of the workers contribute compulsorily to the first pillar, public pillar, and also according to the employment category they belong to. And of course, this is considered on the basis of the specific approach. So we have, for instance, the contribution payment, and also according to the employment category. And then we have the evolution that takes place on an annual basis. And then every year, for instance, we have the age and the seniority requirements that step in order to, for instance, consider the pension requirements. And if you opt for the retirement, then of course the payment is issued, and the indexation is according to the pension amount. So the retirement choice. At the moment, this is deterministic in the sense that it is very much simplified, because all workers access retirement as soon as requirements are met. And well, the exception is those that, for instance, meet the criteria of the quota 100 and seniority for early workers, where the 75% probability is considered. And we have extended this assumption also to the workers that access seniority as early workers, because all the categories cannot sum up, for instance, pension-related income to work-related income. And the fact that individuals access retirement as soon as they can, well, this might seem acceptable at the moment. That is to say, And however, as the rules of the contributions come into play, we do expect that pensions on average decrease, and that we have a clear economic incentive to continue to work and to postpone retirement in order to increase the benefits and then the transformation benefits. Actually, in this case, the main item is that of solving on the one side you have the time spent in retirement, on the other side you have the level of the requirement. So actually this is a strong assumption in a sense. So far we talked about old age pensions. However, in TDIM, we've also simulated other items, this is say minimum for pensions, and also, for instance, inability pensions, like severe inability or total inability, or the survivor pensions. I will not linger on these three items, but of course, some steps forward need to be made with a view to depart from a model that only refers to pensions to a model that also considers, for instance, inequality and different types of social security contributions. Let us move on to the private scheme, and Michele Bavaro mentioned that in the previous panel. At a comparative level, of course, it is clear that in this case it is not compulsory, rather this depends on a choice made. And the rest of the module works the same way, in the same way as the public one. So on an annual basis, the potential scheme is considered. And when you access the retirement scheme, the indexation intervenes with a different system as compared to the public system. Let us now consider some preliminary results. So first of all, how the sample of retired or pensioners evolve. So for instance, he accesses retirement and at the beginning of the simulation, the vast majority belonged to the mixed 2011. That is to say, those that moved to the schemes after the adoption of the Fornero law, as from 2012. Then, at the center of the simulation, there's a mixed 1995 which prevails. So after the Gini reform, so as from 1996, and then the vast majority are newly retired pension people, that is say only the amount for the calculation of the scheme. But if we look at the stock of pensioners, so all of the pensioners and not just those that access retirement at that age, then we see that half of pensioners have the amount entirely calculated with, for instance, the remuneration rule. And the vast majority, at least a portion of the scheme, is calculated to the remuneration rule, and that was, just to give you an idea, 1996, 2046, 2050, just to give you an idea in terms of projection. So if we move from the schemes to the channels, here we propose this distinction between old age and seniority approaches. So old age, the main requirement is age, of course, and in the seniority requirement is, of course, the period of contribution. And if you have old age 1 and old age 3, they are exclusively devoted to the, let's say, a mere and pure contribution approach. And then this is just for the pure contribution workers. And then quota 100, and this is among the seniority items, and this is valid for 2019, 2021. And in the non-simulated, we have APE and Opzione Donna. No simulation was made due to time constraints and also because they are not the main channels to access retirement. And also for the opzione donna, women option, this depends on the option available, because of course when workers have the opportunity to for instance, get additional years, but up to 9 years, because from the 67 she may go up to 58 years, but she has to move on to the seniority approach, and then to reduce the amount that she's going to get. And so all of those that meet the requirements choose to spend more time in retirement, well, that choice would be too strong in a sense. So we are constrained to introducing something when it comes to the choice of contribution before simulating such a channel. Then the evolution from the point of view of the channel. So at the beginning, and here we are in line with the findings of the IMSS report, the most commonly used criteria, those that refer to the seniority group, so well above half of them. And also, the seniority principles are difficult to meet, because we know that the seniority principle in terms for these seniority channels is in line with life expectancy, as it happens with the age requirement. So this is difficult to achieve, despite of the Block 2 adjustment that came into force in 2019, and that will be in force up to 2026. So if we make a distinction by gender, and we consider gender situation and group, early retirement, all of the seniority channels, plus the old age one item, then, and this is what we saw before, then we see that women have more difficulties in meeting early retirement requirements, and this is based on our simulation. And of course, because they have more fragmented and shorter careers. This means, in terms of average age for retirement, in 2019, both in TDIM and in the latest report, of course, the age is 64, but at the end of the simulation, according to the TDIM results, the average age for women is higher than men by nearly 1 year and 4 months. So how this translates in terms of average years spent in retirement? At the beginning of the simulation, the difference between men and women for this variable was slightly exceeding 5 years, but then at the end of the simulation, it was reduced to 5 years. This is despite of the life expectancy by men and women, and despite of the fact that it's not converging. And this can have an impact on adequacy by considering at the welfare system the role of women traditionally in Italian households. And after increasing the variable we are analyzing, the effect of the adequacy and adjustment to life expectancy is starting to play a role, and we see that the dynamic is decreasing then. So let us have an overview of a series of indicators which are typical in terms of adequacy for pensions, and we look at the aggregate ratio. So between the median pension scheme between 65 and 74 years, and gross median individual earnings from work 50 to 59 years of age. So in line with what we observed in the historical trends, the indicator increases slightly in the first years of the simulation, and then it decreases and stabilizes above 65. But then there's a recovery when it comes to the data relating to women, and an alignment around 2030. But if we look at the gender gap in pensions, in order to continue to talk about gender situations, which is of course, the ratio between the average pension of women between 65 and 79, and the average pension between men and women, same age. Well, after 2030, there's a drop of the indicator, from 36 at the beginning of the simulation up to 17% roughly. But then there's a minimum level and the indicator is not going down any longer. Then if we look at the results in terms of cohorts, then our simulations are not too extensive, because 35 years of simulation only. So the cohorts have been arranged with a difference of, let's say, a limited number of years. So look at the average age. It increases by over 1 year. And the years of contribution on average decrease, and this is based for the assumption we made relating to the access of pensions as soon as possible, and also because the careers of young cohorts are more fragmented and not so continuous as the other ones. And the gross replacement rate drops in a constable way. And also this indicator, that is to say, the objective indicator that we developed, they say gross pension, well, this decreases clearly during the simulation time, the simulation period. So here we see the distribution of the gross replacement rate that we saw in the previous slide, and we see it by periods of simulation. At the beginning, we had a replacement rate for nearly retired persons is distributed around 70%, and then everything moves towards the left-hand side. So at the end of the simulation, it's around 50. And of course, we assess the impact for private pensions. And here, if we consider the gross average replacement rate, during the simulation, the impact of private pensions was quite limited, and also steady over the time of the simulation, in consideration of the assumptions made, and specifically when it comes to the rates, which have to remain constant. And then if the impact on average of private pensions is limitedly relevant, and what remains in place is the inequality indicator. So, of course, you see in the chart, if we consider just, for instance, the public pension, we see that there's a decreasing trend, because the contribution system reduces the average pension, and also it includes a number of characteristics based on which inequalities among pensioners are reduced, because it, of course, impacts on short careers and explosive careers. If you also consider the private pensions, then the pensions of the second and third pillar, and yet this is the dotted line, then the trend remains as a decreasing one, but different from the other one. And then we have the labor income as a point of reference and comparison. So if we consider always from the inequality point of view, the gender gap in pensions, well, here as well, private pensions have let's say, slowing down or breaking effect on gender equality, although by 3 to 4 percentage points. Then, having considered we tend to be late, I will not linger on the findings, because actually the things I said so far are not key findings, but actually these are the main results. The caveats, actually, I already talked about the assumption based on which workers retire as soon as they meet the requirements and as soon as they're entitled to. And also, migrants do not have and do not carry over any pension rights eventually acquired, and they don't carry over anything, just a few individual variables to describe them. And of course, this is in line with the fact that return migration is not simulated. So this leads to an underestimation of the final pensions, because at least some of these migrant workers probably already has an import, a pension that can be imported from abroad. And then additional implementations and future implementations. Well, of course, the inclusion of a number of behavioral components in accessing pensions And here it is possible to keep it simple, because in the past, for instance, workers considered the level of the replacement rate, and if such level, also in consideration of the requirements to access pensions, if this was lower or equal to the replacement rate at the aggregate replacement ratio at the beginning of the simulation, then of course the choice was in favor of pension and retirement, whereas alternatively some additional considerations can be made on the level of the pension. Otherwise, it's important to include a more complex behavioral, let's say, approach. And always in line with what I said before, maybe it is the case to identify, find a way to give entitlements to migrants, but we have limited data, so we should be doing assumptions which are not actually so accurate. And we also talked about the involvement of, and with COVID. So we are certainly going to work on the enrichment of the private sub-module. And this was mentioned in panel 2, but for sure this is one of the aspects we will work upon also by the deadline of December 2021. This concludes my contribution, and I give the floor to Stefano. Okay, I hope you can see the presentation which I'm sharing. Thank you, Riccardo. And in the 20 minutes I have at my disposal, I'll tell you about the structure of the tax benefit module, and then all of the modules of TDIM, also because, of course, they are included in the tax benefit module. And of course, this is in order to check the entitlements. So the tax benefit module, which of course is presiding the part relating to consumption. So I'll try to provide you with some ideas about the sequence of the module, so in terms of taxes, and then also for transfers. And then I will describe the main institutions and approaches we have simulated. So we start with the social insurance contributions, IVS, disability, old age, and survivors' pensions, and non-IVS contributions. So, of course, this falls within the model presiding the wealth module. Then we move on to the other approaches, that is to say, the proportional taxes for a number of items that you see listed here in the slide, and also income that have to be simulated because, of course, we have a number of social security approaches that include these items, and these entitlements have become increasingly important. So think, for instance, about the increase in, for instance, rental income, for instance, subject to the so-called cedolare secca or productivity bonuses. And then also we have to consider that the private pensions and the capital income gains in the second and third pillars, well, they are included as well. Whereas those that avail themselves of the, for instance, lump sum approaches, well, they are simulated within the tax benefit module, and also thanks to the, for instance, likelihood approach that we derived from, for instance, the tax returns. And also we move on to the simulation of the income taxes, and I'd like to clarify in this connection that there are some items linked to the simulation of, for instance, deductions. For instance, the main ones and the most relevant ones also in aggregate terms are all simulated internally within the model, and therefore I'm talking about, for instance, the actions of social security contributions, and also supplementary pensions, and so on and so forth. Whereas on the other side, when it comes to deductions, we find the deductions coming from a self-employed or employee activity. And also, for instance, we have a series of deductions that are entered according to the overall income class, subject to income tax. So I'll share with you some examples. That is to say, for instance, the payments to and donations to religious institutions, or the education expenses, or also in the expenses incurred for instance, a residential home refurbishment. And in this case as well, everything is done by using the probabilistic equation that we derived from the 4 waves AD-silk linked to, for instance, tax deductions. So this is a rather common practice when it comes to the static simulation approach, that in this case we applied to a dynamic framework. Moving on to the simulation of, for instance, transfers, here I included the unemployment benefits from all of the other benefits, because of course they fall within this approach, but that comes before the income simulation as such. And if you look at the sequence with which we simulated all of the other transfers, then we have the 100 euros bonus, and of course the portion of the bonus which is granted for those that exceed 28,000 euros. And then we also find all of the pensions in terms of, for instance, disability allowance, and also the 14th month pension, and social allowance, and family allowance, and also the minimum income schemes, and also, for instance, the family allowances. Last but not least is the simulation of the minimum income schemes. So, of course, in 2017 we had the first one, and then the inclusion income in 2018, and then from 2019 onwards, the so-called citizenship, or let's say reddito di cittadinanza. I'd like to now make an analysis of some of the key assumptions of the tax benefit module by recalling that the ones I listed are not exhaustive relating to all of the assumptions we carried out. However, if you have any specific questions, and if time allows, I can certainly reply. But as from 2014, all of the tax benefit parameters, that is to say the thresholds used in the simulation of deductions, and also the thresholds used in checking compliance with some of the preconditions, where also the IPEF thresholds, as from 2024, of course, follow the nominal GDP growth. And of course, they either change or remain constant as it is provided for by the provisions in force. And also the recipients of specific incomes are referred to some, let's say, areas of the population by considering a total number, and this is derived from the administrative data for 2019, and these sources are listed here in the slide. So an important assumption is one linked to, for instance, the take-up rate. And in the first draft of the model, we consider a full take-up rate. That is to say, all those that meet conditions for take-up will do that, and we get it. And of course, this coincides with the real beneficiaries. And after considering this first part, when we outline the main structure of the tax benefit module, I'd like to move on to the comment on some preliminary results. And I will focus on the redistribution effect, and also the income through the OECD modified equivalent scale, and also the income definitions that results are based upon, and which include the first one, that is to say, market income plus pensions. And then we also, for instance, need to add the market income plus pensions plus benefits, and then we deduct taxes by getting the income and available or disposable income. The disposable income. And of course, we have a difference between the Gini index for market income plus pensions and the Gini income for market income plus pensions plus benefits equals the redistribution effect of benefits, whereas the difference between the Gini index and the one in orange and the one in blue, well, this represents of course, the final effect minus taxes. If you look at the chart at the center, which is true for all individuals, we see how the effect of benefits increases to the detriment of the effect of taxes. And this is mainly true for those that are aged over 65, where we see an explosion in the inequality of market income that apparently slows down in 2035. So this explosion in the Gini index of equivalized income among the over 65ers is slowed down by, for instance, the social allowance that I will mention later. And also, if you look at the blue distribution, that is to say, the Gini income for market income plus pensions plus social allowance and integrations, then you see how the trend seems to change as from 2030, whereas the trend continues to increase for the Gini index relating to, for instance, market income plus pensions. And as regards, conversely, the growth of the Gini index and also market income and pensions for 2030, well, this increase might be explained, in a sense, through an increase in the number of areas of distribution. In fact, they all include zeros, because a growing number of individuals, for instance, might not meet the requirements needed, and a remarkable portion of individuals from 2020 and 2030 fall within the mixed system, so they are not retiring unless they have 20 years of seniority and contributions. So let us now disassemble the progressivity effect and average tax rate, and which is clear in this type of analysis. So how to read and interpret this chart? As the progressive effect decreases, the progressivity of benefits increases. Hence, a higher portion of benefits is allocated to those in need, whereas as the average tax rate decreases, the amount of benefits received on average increases. And if we focus on the central chart, we see both the progressivity effect in here, you see, and also the average tax rate in orange. So they are both led by what happens with the 65ers, where the impact on the benefits doubles, and the progressivity effect goes from minus 0.8 to minus 0.9. And if we consider the same situation when it comes to the tax side, the progressivity effect and the average tax rate have to be read the opposite way. So as the progressivity decreases, the progressivity of taxes decreases as well, and so the opposite as before happens. And if we consider all of the individuals, so the central chart, we see that there's a decrease in the average tax rate, mainly led by the decrease in the number of the tax rate for the over 65ers. And this is a substantial imbalance in the progressivity of taxes. And in fact, although this imbalance is the result of two opposite approaches and curves, because of course the progressivity of taxes increases for the 40 to 65ers and decreases for those aged up to 18. So actually this chart shows and suggests an increase in the selectivity rate of the tax system, because a higher portion and rate of the taxes impacts on 18 to 64 age brackets, and this is linked to the selectivity of IRPEF, which is often blamed for being too selective. That is to say, the employed people and retired people. And a further increase in the selectivity to the detriment of employed workers might also depend on the reduction of the average amount of pensions with the full enforcement of the contribution approach that will lead to a growing number of pensioners that are entitled to less deductions. So in this chart, we see the percentage of benefits and taxes on the equalized disposable income by decile, in line with what we said so far. On the right-hand side chart, you see, for instance, the 2050 tax benefit system, especially for the deciles from the 2nd to the 5th. And at the same time, we do observe a rather generalized decrease in the amount of taxes paid, and this result increases in tax benefits, but rather reflects also the aging of population. And in fact, if we look at the number of, for instance, recipients of selected benefits out of the total of population, for instance, the T2, for instance, social pensions and disability allowances and pension integrations, well, in this case, the increase that we see in the number of recipients is explained thanks to the increase in the portion of old population that is the main beneficiary of this type of benefits. And also, another important thing to say is the reduction in the number of beneficiaries or recipients based on, for instance, family allowances and, for instance, those that receive the citizenship income. So this may be partly explained by the sequence-based approach of the model, or also by the assumptions in terms of growth of the economy. And if we move on to the S80, S20 of equalized disposable income by age group, which is quite common in statistics, then what must be stressed, in my opinion, is that it seems that the differential is quite marked by age groups, whereas the situation is different if you consider a distribution of the population by gender, and also the Gini income, and also there's an overview of preliminary results by showing to you the rate divided by age brackets and gender brackets, and in this case, of course, as to the interquartile ratio, there's a gender differential, and of course, women risk to be in a situation of poverty much more than men, whereas the risks of poverty decrease according to the age brackets, and the increase in the risk of poverty for the over 65ers is in line with the results I've showed to you before relating to the Gini index for the disposable equivalent. So this slide, well, I can skip it, and I move on to the future implementations. So the main intention is to further enrich the tax benefit form and module, with the housing taxation and the VAT and the mother bonus and the newborn bonus. So these are benefits that we are not simulating at the moment, but which we may include in our modules. And also the take-up rates. And also it is important to understand whether the take-up rates have to be somehow interrelated, as there can be some individual characteristics or family characteristics that can be observed and which lead individuals to ask for measures instead of other measures. And also the tax benefit module is the one that better suits the simulation in terms of alternative scenarios, and also the definition of policy scenarios. Well, it's going to be tackled later, and that concludes my contribution. Thank you.
So, great, we are on time. I don't think we need to recap because the presentation was very consistent. And I would like to give the floor again to our speaker, starting with Professor Figari with his presentation. Hello, here I am. You can see my slides, I think. I will begin by saying that I will focus on the tax benefit module. Then my colleagues, particularly Carlo Mazzaferro, is going to focus on the pension module. So what can I say? Well, I can begin by expressing my appreciation for what was done and what was illustrated today. No doubt a method that cannot but be commended because of its richness. I wish to be perhaps provocative, but in a positive way. When I say, as some of you already said, such as Paola Ciari, microsimulation, well, the devil is in the details. So I want to be provocative in the sense that I'm not fully convinced that the one-fits-all model is always the winning model. What do I mean by this? Well, no doubt TIDIM is a very rich model. And in the presentations, I looked at the slides and today's presentations, you have said very clearly that what was presented today is an important result, but is also a starting point. So your goal is to include indirect taxes or taxes on property, many other aspects, which are all important. But as far as my experience is concerned, is essential when you build an infrastructure that is so big and also that is so intensive in terms of resources. Well, when you do that, you have to have very clear in mind what is your research goal. It can be academic research, it can be research focused on policy scenarios, but keeping the goal in mind is essential, because then a good model is what comes out of the model itself. Otherwise, I think that there's a risk of spending a lot of energy in setting up an infrastructure that when we use it is already old-fashioned, or when we start using it, we realize that some important aspects are missing. There may be details, but still essential ones for that specific type of application. So when I say that I'm not really fully convinced that the one-fits-all model is the best, it's because when we think about the objective of one of its applications, we think, for instance, about future pension adequacy that you spoke about, or the distribution of household incomes, now and in the future. Well, these two aspects or processes are not opposing with one another. Actually, one is the consequence of the other. But then the modeling of these processes may, to some extent, need some different ingredients or different processing. And I'm referring to things that were said this morning. What was interesting was the module for correcting the incomes of self-employed workers based on IMSS data banks and tax return data. But there's an aspect here. If you're interested in distributing household income, then in a context such as the one we have in Italy, we cannot but consider tax evasion. A tax evasion that we know is by definition difficult to treat, but survey information or information from more than one survey can be helpful in addressing this issue. Another aspect, which in my opinion is still related to this idea, so understanding our goal to then understand what tools is the most appropriate to deal with it, is related to the topic of the weights, reweighting, calibration, alignments. And in this sense, I share the interest that was expressed today, because a lot of discussions were focused on reweighting, how to deal with it. But I think that reweighting is really an essential aspect, which in scientific debate is one of the reasons why microsimulation models and the studies based on these models are sometimes accused to be models that are produced and self-fed as black boxes you cannot really take a look at. And this sort of undermines the reliability and the credibility of these models. So this brings me to a conclusion which is essential, which is that of validation and internal and external validity, and we can of course debate what expressions we want to use. I think that validation is essential. When we speak about a model which is so complex as TDIM is, this validation must concern processes and transitions that have been simulated over time in the various modules. And in this sense, I fully agree with what was said this morning, I think by Giovanni Gallo, the idea of saying, well, starting from year zero, which is the beginning of the available data, what is the validation that comes out of the simulations for the years in which we do have some real observations? So we can start from year zero up until the present time. If we had started then, how much this model would have allowed us to make correct the right predictions. So we need to validate processes, but also instruments, and particularly what was simulated by the tax benefit module. So this is a message which is not in the slides because, of course, it's something that I sort of developed based on what I heard up until now. In the slides that I'm going to briefly illustrate, since time is running, well, the caveat is that I prepared these slides based on the slides that I was sent myself, so I apologize if some of my comments are not relevant, because perhaps they've already been clarified by the speakers. So the model resorts to a huge amount of data, and of course this represents an advantage. And that is why in this connection, I think that what is going to be essential is that the accompanying documentation is totally clear in terms of the information used, what variables from what sources. Samples are clearly spelled out, starting and output, and then assumptions and reweighting. And this in order to sort of try and prevent possible criticism that readers may raise. As far as variables are concerned, so information, survey data that are linked to fiscal, to tax codes, administrative data. So if you are familiar with the availability of administrative data, you mustn't be surprised that tax returns were only used for 4 years, not for all years. But all these aspects, I think, should not be taken for granted. Otherwise, we risk undermining what I was just saying. So when we quote the statistical matching of the SHIY, I'm not so sure to what extent the longitudinal element of this study is actually used in order to estimate behaviors in the wealth module or others. As far as some other aspects are concerned, I think they were clarified by presentations. I read that some detractions and deductions had been entirely taken from administrative data. And I was a little bit taken aback, but then it was clarified that this is not the case, at least as far as the main ones are concerned. So this is an essential aspect. As to income from self-employed work, so self-employment income, I think it's important to look at consequences in terms of tax evasion. Of course, if you take data from tax return, you take data that has been declared, but there is all the tax evasion that can lead to a distribution of the available income that is quite different. So in this sense, the validation that I was suggesting that should be carried out is a validation also of the results versus the actual survey, so versus the picture that comes out also directly from the survey. Because if we believe in the survey information, as I do and I assume you all do, it is from there that we get important information concerning the relative weights and distribution of evasion. And then, of course, we can agree or maybe disagree with the possible uses of surveys in order to have an estimate of evasion, but this is essential. So you cannot really not consider evaded income, because this would be problematic. As far as the sample is concerned, well, here I only have some suggestions that really do not imply that you have to do additional work because it was so comprehensive. But an aspect which is alternative perhaps, but not necessarily valid for the purposes of the dynamic model, could also be an alternative approach. So starting from a cross-sectional silk sample, this sample could or may be made longitudinal through observations that we get in the IMSS data bank and in tax return data. So this is the approach that we followed in cooperation with some colleagues from the Department of the Ministry of Finance. When starting from silk, we rebuilt the longitudinal component based on tax return data. Socio-demographic patterns are part of the sample refer to a specific period in time, but it is true that a number of transitions could be estimated based on reconstructed data based on tax returns and administrative data, with the advantage that this would provide a much broader sample compared with the longitudinal one. As to assumptions and reweightings, well, we say that reweighting is a common practice in microsimulation analysis. Yes, this is true, particularly as far as process dynamics is concerned. So process reweighting is important in transition processes when you cannot estimate things on individual data. They can be imputed to the model through reweighting. As far as I'm concerned, and also based on the practice of static microsimulation models that are used at the academic level rather than for policy analysis purposes, I think I can say not to calibrate results of simulations of the tax benefit model in terms of reweighting, nor in terms of pure calibration, because when we do reweighting, and other speakers have said so, the risk we run is that in order to improve the representativeness in some dimensions, we end up by distorting others. And in addition, we run the risk of distorting what the distribution of income or some of its components versus the initial sample. And in this connection, and also Marco Di Marco is going to speak after me in this panel, so I'm not going to say anything concerning surveying, but I think I can safely say that in Italy we are very lucky because we have some samples that over time have been confirmed being well-made samples, and samples that can be used to make also analysis of the tax benefit type with results that are totally reliable and credible. So in this sense, I would look at reweighting at its impact on the static portion of the model. I would I would buy it, let's say, only if it were a necessary step for what comes beforehand in the model. So not for static microsimulation purposes. I would not adopt reweighting and calibration, also because we must not necessarily get to a result corresponding to that of external aggregated statistics. So in micro simulations, to respond to what if analysis, it may be necessary to look at results in terms of absolute or relative variations compared with the starting point, not so much in the aggregate phase. As far as validation is concerned, well, I think it is very important, particularly for the baseline, so the base year comparison with external sources. And in this sense, what has to do with take-up and tax evasion is really important. As far as take-up is concerned, we will learn a lot from the study and the work conducted by Massimo Baldini in the Visiting program of 2020, if we want to also look at the take-up behavior of those who receive the recipient of the basic income, reddito di cittadinanza. As far as tax evasion is concerned, using survey and administrative data with some colleagues, we managed to get to an estimate based on a bottom-up approach using microdata, reaching the estimate of the tax evasion of self-employed workers. So these two aspects, but particularly tax evasion, are essential in order to arrive to a distribution of income that is actually very similar to the actual real distribution and that recorded with the survey. Validation, also concerning the original survey data, is very important, and two aspects which are important are the following. For instance, I'm not clear why in the various notions of income you also include cadastral income, because cadastral income is not really a replacement for the imputed rent, which is usually used in welfare analysis. And then another aspect that attracted my interest is the Gini index concerning pensions. I want to share with you these two charts. At the left, it seems that Gini decreases, while to the right, Gini seems to increase. The explanation after the last presentation by Stefano seems to me to be that the equivalent scale was used differently, in the sense that the right-hand chart is based on equivalent income, perhaps the one to the left isn't, and I would like a clarification for me to better understand. And I would like to conclude bringing forward some proposals. You made a great job, and I think it is important to then test things, but I'm not the one, of course, having to suggest it. So we should find the appropriate balance between the complexity of the model and its actual use for scientific and policy analysis purposes. Therefore, passing through the transparency of assumptions and implications, validation of results, and also through another aspect. Such a complex model, of course, requires resources, energy to be maintained and updated, because once it is used for policy-related analysis, then it has to be something it's something that is necessary on a day by day basis. So during the last round table, starting from specific scenarios and focusing on them, well, I think we could then use this to understand what developments are required in this model and what parts of this model should be used and sort of tested in order to see how they perform. I will stop here, and I hope I didn't take up more time than I was given. Thank you, Francesco Figari. You said so many things. Well, as far as the Gini index is concerned, well, yes, actually, the figures are differences, magnitudes are differences. In the first, I was looking at gross pension without considering the zeros, because precisely we wanted to look at what happens in terms of effects in the variation of pension rules, whereas Stefano was showing equivalent income, considering zeros, and then he was considering people over 65, whereas I was looking at people who receive occupational pension. So two different types of data. I will not focus on the various questions, but I think that this model has to be given a specific line of research. This is something I totally agree with, and it's also useful for the purposes of our roundtable. Now I'm going to give the floor to Marco Di Marco. Good evening.